Okay. Hello, good evening, day or morning, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us today for 2019 M Plus Design Trust Research Fellow Public Talk Part 1 with Oliver Elsag. My name is Iko Yokoyama, Lead Curator of Design Architecture at M Plus. M Plus is soon to be Open Museum Visual Culture in Hong Kong, which we have started building the building and the collection since 2012. As the early stage of institutional development, Design Trust gave us Entrust and the generous support to funding this fellowship program, which brought indispensable enhancement of curatorial research in the subject, as well as building the wide range of networks of scholars and practitioners looking into this region. 2019's fellowship is our fifth round, and we are very glad that Design Trust is willing to support the research area go beyond Hong Kong and Greater Bay Area as well, which align with our interest to looking at the region through wider geographical approaches. And today's discussion will be moderated by our curator, Shari Surya. And this event is possible by her, together with the curatorial assistant, Noel Chung's hard work. Thank you both. And with our sincere thanks to the Design Trust, I hand over for a few words to the co-founder and executive director, Marissa Yu.
Hello, welcome. Thank you, Iko. And it's so great to see all of you, despite we don't actually see all of you. It's been an extraordinary year for all of us, and we're really excited to be grateful to be part of this event. As Iko mentioned, Design Trust was established in 2014 by Hong Kong Ambassador Design, a registered charity in Hong Kong since 2007 as a grant funding platform and community design engagement project. And as we've been also reflecting on our foundation's work, it's been extraordinary to see how much development of expertise and research initiatives have been coming through with our partnership with M+. So thank you, it's very exciting. And we're pleased to welcome Oliver. I have to admit, we were very much excited to have you here in Hong Kong. In the context of St. Stephen's College, which is one of your projects on investigation as a moment of brutalist architecture for Hong Kong. And it's been an incredible process to see our first fellow, Fan Ling, even back in 2015, presenting in different spaces in Hong Kong. And today we have you here on a virtual conferencing, which we're finally extraordinarily excited to be part of. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, and thank you very much to M+ and colleagues and friends for setting this up today. Very much hope to see all of you soon back in Hong Kong.
Hello, all. Good evening. And again, thank you, Iko and Marissa, for the introductions. And I'm Shirley Surya, a curator for design and architecture at M+. And I just wanted to have a very, kind of a quick introduction of our presenter, Oliver Elser, our 2019 M+ Design Trust Research Fellow, as well as our invited discussant, Patrick Huang from CUHK. So I just wanted to mention that Oliver is a critic, a historian, and curator at the Deutsche Architecture Museum, or the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt. And he's created amazing shows that we've seen, Making Heimat, Germany, a rival country for the German Pavilion at the Venice Biennale 2016, and the hugely popular SOS Brutalism, Save the Concrete Monsters in 2017, which now travel to Taipei. So it's really a very impressive global survey of brutalism via a hugely successful crowdsourcing social media campaign. It's also the reason why M+ and Design Trust have chosen to support Oliver for his research proposal. We were very excited when we received it because basically the issue of brutalism has been something of interest to us, especially when some of the works that are in the M+ collection archives of Hong Kong architecture, especially those by Jackson Wong, as well as Dennis Lau in the early 60s, 70s, are represented in the collection. And then Oliver actually are interested in these projects. And so we really are looking forward to how Oliver's proposal is able to really situate brutalism in Hong Kong's very pluralist context. And so you would see later in Oliver's presentation how it would actually provoke and expand how brutalism is defined as a movement, as a style or aesthetic, or even a set of principles, how it can be rehistoricized, and how it can possibly even incite design practice today or in the future. And I also want to introduce Patrick Huang. Thank you again, Patrick, for taking up our invitation. Patrick is assistant professor at the School of Architecture in CUHK. He was trained at RISD and Columbia University and has a decade-long experience practicing architecture in the offices of Rafael Vanoli, Michael Maltzan, and Frank Gehry. And at CUHK, he's also director of undergraduate program and chair of teaching and learning committee. And Patrick has been interested in the research of architectural education with particular focus on the role of the projective archive in refabricating cultures of the city as a device for experiencing material history. Okay, this is quote unquote from your bio, but we are particularly interested in Patrick's perspective on this topic from the perspective of a practitioner, as well as a design educator, as opposed to a purely a historian. And so without further ado, we would just invite Oliver to present his findings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Hello from Frankfurt. I would love to be in Hong Kong again. I hope we will get back one day. And thanks for the nice introduction. And I just wanted to begin with an overview. So yeah. Thank you. So the lecture will have, next, please. The lecture will have two parts. The first is about, I just read what's written there, the unresolved case of brutalism, definitions, a new canon, and the so-called monster category. And in the second part, I will propose a critical reading of brutalism in Hong Kong. And I will speak about the classical examples, and I hope I have some provoking thoughts about enlarging the canon. But before I start, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the fantastic opportunity to expand the SOS Brutalism project to Hong Kong. My thanks go to Marisa Yu, Shirley Surya, Noel Chung, Iko Yokoyama, Jennifer Wong, William Sung, Samson Wong, Man Han, Jimmy Lam, Charlie Hu, and my respondents to this lecture, last but not least, Patrick Huang. Next image, please. My occupation with brutalism started with a blast. In 2014, a seminar building of the Frankfurt University was blown up. The high-rise building, with its massive exposed concrete skeleton on the outside, was inaugurated in 1972, which is my year of birth, by the way. So, I mean, this is about getting older. Almost at the same time as the Historical Museum of the City of Frankfurt. Next. Buildings like these had polarized the population and also the experts from the very beginning. They were not listed as monuments, and so they have been demolished after 40 years of operation. Next. The museum did not get a second chance. Otherwise, one might have noticed that the architecture of the museum is not as dismissive as it was always accused. A closer look would have revealed connections to the neighboring half-timbered house. The concrete consoles of the museum could be regarded as transformations of the cantilevered beams of the timber construction. Next. This principle of translating a wooden construction into a concrete construction has its origins not in Frankfurt, but in Japan. The architect Kenzo Tange has created a special kind of metabolism, and I'm speaking here not in the exact term of metabolism in the way of architectural history, but more in the sense of direct sense of Gottfried Semper. So it's about transforming one material into the other. So by this metabolism, Kenzo Tange in the Kagawa prefectural office for the first time transformed a wooden construction into concrete. And this goes back to a discussion among Japanese architects, the so-called Dento Ronzo debate, about possible ways to express tradition and modernity on equal terms. I dare to say that the museum in Frankfurt, which you see on the lower right, with its concrete consoles also quotes the Japanese model on the one hand, and its neighbor, the half-timbered house opposite, on the other. So what gives me the security to make such connections from Frankfurt to Japan, from 72 to 58? My judgment is based on the huge pool of buildings that we have included in our database SOS Brutalism. There are currently almost 2,000 buildings in that open database. Next. We have arranged, here we try to do it in the analog way, and we have arranged printouts of these data in such a way that new patterns have emerged in the abundance of brutalist architecture, and tendencies have become visible that have not been taken into account in previous historiography. This database is an experiment in how a new canon can emerge from crowd intelligence and from a large number of examples, of course. The mass of entries goes far beyond anything that has ever been dealt with in academic literature, I would say. Why is this collection necessary? Is it all about juggling with images? I like to call it an atlas, gathering basic research, because what we're dealing with, the so-called brutalism, is an unstable, underdefined field. Next. The term brutalism originated in Great Britain in the early 1950s in the context of a debate on the future of modern architecture that took place within a narrow circle of people. We see here the architects Alison Smithson and Peter Smithson, as well as the architectural historian and critic Reyner Banham on his bike. Next. The Smithsons did not, they did write about the term brutalism, but they did not write it down in a manifesto. They built the manifesto of brutalism. Their school in Hunstanton, which you can see here, is described by others than the Smithsons as the first brutalist buildings. In this school, there is no béton brut. There is almost no exposed concrete, except in the form of the floor. The Smithsons were not primarily interested in form or a particular material, but in a new direct way of approaching the design of a building. And I quote them here: "We were concerned with the seeing of materials for what they were, the woodness of wood, the sandiness of sand." Next. Also, Reyner Banham does not speak of exposed concrete in the first place. Instead, he draws parallels to the visual arts of his time, art brut. He gives further examples of which buildings he considers brutalist. These include Louis Kahn's Yale Art Gallery, a building that uses considerably more exposed concrete than the Smithson School. Next. In 1955, Banham defined 3 criteria as ethical principles of brutalism. First is the memorability as an image. Second, the clear exhibition of structure. Third, the valuation of materials as found. Next. So is the definition of brutalist architecture as so-called exposed concrete architecture just a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation? No, it is already in the term brutalism itself, in which concrete is inscribed indeniably. In his Unité d'habitation, Le Corbusier for the first time did not paint over the concrete, nor did he have it refined with stone masonry techniques. The surface is left as it was when the construction workers have taken down the roughly timbered shuttering boards. Le Corbusier gives his new treatment of concrete the name béton brut. Brut means dry, raw, unrefined, and has, at least in French, an echo in a bottle of champagne that is also called brut. So this is not an advertisement here, it's just a reference to the use of the term brut in France. In the English language, brutalism has the overtone of brutality, of course. At least for Banham, we know that he was well aware of the ambiguities that brutalism has. And I quote, "What characterizes the new brutalism is precisely its brutality, its bloody mindlessness." Next. So brutalism took its name from rough exposed concrete, but the first built examples, like the School of the Smithsons, that have been labeled with this term were mostly brick and steel constructions. However, this changed soon enough. And to give one example, one of the most famous, I would say, the Art and Architecture department is built from 58 onwards. The architect Paul Rudolph erected a building for Yale University that was sharply criticized at the opening, even by the keynote speaker, the architectural historian Nikolaus Pevsner. It is far too obstinate, he says, meaning that the opulent formal aspects of this building might distract students from designing straightforward functional structures. Raymer Banham, he did not include the Art and Architecture building in his 1966 book on brutalism, although it was finished right in time. No, Banham had strong objections against the course that brutalism took since its inauguration in 1953. Next slide. Banham writes in a famous quote, "The Johnsons, Johansons, and Rudolphs of the American scene were quicker than I was to see that the brutalists were really their allies, not mine, committed in the last resort to the classical tradition, not the technological." In other words, in the USA, and in many other parts of the world, by the way, brutalism has developed into a kind of neo-traditionalism. As you see here with these brief examples, each of them, Philip Johnson, John Johansson, and Paul Rudolph, has used the béton brut to create a temple. We see two temples here, a nuclear power plant by Philip Johnson, a temple as a library by Johansson, or a fortress by Paul Rudolph. For Banham, that meant the definitely end of brutalism. In his 1966 book, he declared that the early ethical approaches of brutalism have turned into a style, an aesthetic. Brutalism was declared dead by its major historian. Next. But when the swan song on brutalism was published, it was by no means only the Johnsons, Johansson, and Rudolphs in the USA whose works became more and more distant from the beginning, but were still labeled brutalist in professional journals and by historians. Next. Everywhere in the world, a second generation of brutalist buildings, so we see here the DNA of some of those buildings. Everywhere in the world, a second generation of brutalist buildings emerged, which no longer stood in a theory-based context. The project SOS Brutalism starts exactly at this point, at this vague point of the need for a new definition. We wanted to write a sequel to Banham's book and record everything that Banham would not have agreed with. Next. For this, it was necessary to expand the definition of brutalism by a fourth aspect. Rhetoric was included as a new point. A building is rhetorical when it takes its means of expression as its theme, certainly in the sense of exaggeration. By opening the barriers pretty wide, especially in the direction of the neo-traditional architecture rejected by Banham, we are encountering a completely new genre, and we call it the monsters. Before I finally turn my gaze to Hong Kong, I would like to say something about one of these monsters, because we will encounter it again as a reference to a building in Hong Kong. Next. It has been observed many times that the Boston City Hall has a strong relationship with the cloister La Tourette by Le Corbusier, as we have seen in the previous image. From the comments of the architects and against the backdrop of the debate about the need for an urban renaissance for downtown Boston, we know that the second important source for the design is a temple, or a palazzo, as you can see on the bottom of this page. The elements of classical architecture are all there in the Boston City Hall. A colossal order, a widely projecting cornice, and even the Boston City Hall square was paved as if it has been built in Tuscany and not in the United States. The amount of rhetoric is huge. Almost everything at Boston City Hall is bigger and more massive than necessary. And there's a famous quote from a structural engineer for the building who said, "It would need a nuclear weapon to turn this building ever down." Next. Dealing with fragments or shapes of history is not an exception, but a new standard in those days. US American university architecture is full of such allusions to European antique dignity formulas. Wherever we look, we see temples of all kind in the upper row here on this slide, and a freestanding supersized column, a castle, and a gigantic barn in the lower row. I will return to this concept of the large-scale object loaded with vague traditional references when speaking about a certain kind of Hong Kong architecture in a few minutes. Next. For the brutalism in Hong Kong, I have concentrated on buildings that still exist in their more or less original state. Yet I have omitted a large number of schools, most of which were built in fair-faced concrete from the mid-1960s onwards, because they have been painted over in a colorful way since then without exception. Next. This house is considered the birth of brutalism in Hong Kong. The architect Wong and his partner, Nguyen Chung Man, were among the first class to be trained in the Department of Architecture in the University of Hong Kong. Both left the school in 1955, founding their practice in the same year. Next. Jackson Wong's private house is a concrete box with a wide overhang. An article in Far East Architect and Builder magazine emphasizes the special feature of using exposed concrete of the highest quality, both inside and out. The article says, and I have it underlined in yellow, no special surface treatment of any kind has been applied, and the difference to the then common concrete blocks, and that is drariness and austerity, is especially emphasized. Next. A closer look at the plans that are in the M+ Museum's collection reveal an astonishing detail. Apparently, even at a relatively large stage, it was still assumed that the astonishing parapet bands were to be covered with mosaic tiles, as the inscription on the plans say. Next. The plan, speaking about tiles, date from January 1966 and was approved by the building authority on February 11 of the same year. The building was finished in the same year. The rejection of the tiles seemed to have been a last-minute decision. Somehow, after receiving the approval, the surface was not covered, and it came out in exposed concrete and could be considered as the first example of brutalism. Next. Just for this slide, a brief detour. Of course, we do not know what kind of mosaic tiles the architect had in mind, but it came to my mind how often in Hong Kong there are surfaces which from a distance give the impression that they are made of concrete. After getting closer, it becomes apparent that these are mosaic tiles that seem to imitate an exposed concrete surface. Next. The campus in Shan Tin is the largest example of exposed concrete building in Hong Kong. The CUHK was founded in 1963 as an association of 3 colleges, which were established to provide access to higher education for Chinese-speaking students. One of these colleges was founded by anti-communist Confucian scholars, another by Protestant Christians. The orientation of the CUHK was largely determined by the support of US and British universities. There were close ties to Yale University and the University of Berkeley. Private supporters included the family of the publisher of Time and Life, Henry Luce, a strong anti-communist. Next. The building development in Shan Tin began with Chung Chi College, with the participation of architects Robert Fan and Chow and Lee. Next. In 1963, White Seto joined as an engineer and architect. Under his guidance, the hill adjacent to the Chung Chi College was terraced. Next. The historical photographs show that the campus architecture is dominated by exposed concrete throughout. Different types of concrete processing create an almost ornamental play. Next. This is exemplified here at the Science Center. There, the entire spectrum of concrete processing is demonstrated. Large formwork panels on the muscular supporting structure of the widely overhanging lecture hall. Then the impressions of saw-through-sawn formwork boards on some parapet elements. Next. And finally, areas worked by hand with large sledgehammers, a technique introduced by Paul Rudolph and maybe made by these kind of craftsmen here. Next. White Seto himself called the cantilevered auditorium so-called mushroom, and he even offered an explanation for this sublime gesture. He wanted to create, quote, an unobstructed space for the students, end of quote. This quotation can also be read politically. Obstruction could be understood as a reference to the founding ideas of the CUHK. The new university as a whole could be seen as an unobstructed space that allows Chinese students access to higher education in their own language, instead of visiting institutions no longer accessible in those days on the mainland. No obstacle could be read in that sense as freedom and democracy in both architectural and political terms. Next. In the buildings of the United and New Asia College, the exposed concrete is repeatedly broken up with large white painted surfaces and giving a rhythm. It is regrettable that these contrasts of white color and exposed concrete have been destroyed by the complete overpainting in recent years. Next. One of the few buildings where the concrete was not painted over is the Adam Shaw residence of the New Asia College. Next. A student at the foot of the hill deserves special attentions. The Chungshi Hall Student Center is an unusual A-frame construction. On the historical color photographs, it appears that the beams are made of wood. This is reinforced by the imprint of the formwork boards. Next. And in this context, I would like to remind you of one of the first pictures of this lecture. The transformative power of replacing wood with concrete creates an updated expression of a traditional construction. While the buildings supervised by White Seto follow more or less a modernist canon without compromise, a delicate touch of history, or maybe even of postmodernism, seems to emerge here with the A-frame building. Next. On another, much smaller school campus, I finally managed to find what I have been looking for all this time in Hong Kong. A time capsule, which means a building that has remained largely unchanged. The gymnasium of the St. Stephen's College was completed in 1980. The state of preservation is excellent. Next. Thank you. In comparison to the A-frame at CUHK, the gymnasium makes less obvious relation to wooden construction. It has shifted walls, but the construction remains more or less abstract. However, there is also something of a rhetoric element. Two large cantilever beams that I have marked here in red. Next. One should get really close. Show you some details. The inclined beams have the imprints of formwork boards on the side, which is not unusual. But on the upper side, however, there is a fine grooved structure, which is probably beaten into the hardened concrete by hand. So the whole building actually is treated like a sculpture, like a sculptor would treat a sculpture. The groove on the upper side of the beams is unusual. It seems that when it rains, the water from the water sprouts is let down over the beams and rushes down the building. I would love to see this one day when it rains at the St. Stephen's campus. Next, the large triangles that cantilever at the end of the building also serve to collect water and guide it down along chains. Next. Inside, it seems as if the front wall of the hall has been formed with boards in a particular rough way. The beams, on the other hand, appear rather smooth. Next. If I search our database of brutalist buildings for comparative examples where a similar rhetoric of structural design can be found, I would like to present these two examples here for discussion. One is by Kikutake, the Great Shrine of Izumo, and the other one by Sachio Otani, the Kyoto International Conference Center. Otani is known to have been inspired by the vernacular Gasho-style farmhouses in the Kyoto area. The Shrine of Kikutake also transforms a wooden construction into concrete. Next. The justification for Tao Hou's design strategy can be found on the property as well. In the perspective drawings that Tao Hou has made, one can see that the classroom buildings were to be equipped with deep planned balconies. The classrooms would have disappeared under plans, while the gymnasium is the only building that still stands out. It is a rural picture, almost a pastoral image, in which concrete is blended with the landscape. In the extreme density of Hong Kong, it is an enormous luxury to enter into such a close relationship with nature. Next. What is curious, however, is that the building exists a second time as an exact double, about 30 kilometers away, now painted over white. This double goes without landscape. I like to propose a reading that every copy is a kind of appreciation, not a reproduction of creativity. Next. Finally, I would like to present a building that extends the boundaries of brutalism in a, so to say, brutal way. To the visitor of the cemetery, the columbarium building at the Chuan Wan cemetery appears to be a battleship. The architects are again Dennis Lau and Nguyen Chu Man again. It would be considered a brutalist building without any doubt if it has been executed not in white tiles, but in gray exposed concrete. Next. When the columbarium received the Hong Kong Institute of Architecture Award in 1987, the jury praised the design with the words, I quote, "keeping with the best Chinese architectural tradition," end of quote. Some years before, the architects also experimented with vague Chinese pagoda traditions at the Cape Collingon Crematorium. Should we really consider these as brutalist buildings? Next. I would like to remind you that Boston City Hall and many other buildings also make such more or less vague references to the traditional architecture. As a further example, I show here the National Library of Kyrgyzstan in Bishkek. Here too, the concrete has been clad. It's clad in stone, and the concrete is hidden behind. The columbarium, the Boston City Hall, and many more of these early postmodern monsters, I would love to call them, expand brutalism to the first encounter with postmodernity. Brutalism has often been interpreted as the last arm of modernism, but I would say this is wrong. It already shows the postmodern longing for history and the charging of architecture with symbols, which we can identify here as references to historical architecture. Next. Another example is the Kaohsiung Cultural Center in Taiwan. It was designed in 1975 and inaugurated in 1985. It was, for me, a dream candidate of mine when I was able to visit Taiwan in 2017. Curator Chun Wang has followed the argumentation that it, quote, paved the groundwork for post-war Taiwanese brutalism in response to nationalist notions, transforming traditional language of Chinese architecture through modernist abstraction. End of quote. Nationalist notions. It is interesting what political interpretation is being made here. Obviously, Taiwan shows itself very consciously as a guardian of the Chinese tradition in this building. Brutalism, often described as the architecture of the welfare state and associated with political progress, can also have its dark nationalist sides. The political interpretation is not in the concrete itself, but arises from the circumstances of time and discourses in which architecture is created. Next. I want to end by arranging the examples from Hong Kong along an axis and then claim that there is a departure for new shores. From the classical beginning to CUHK, that is one direction. From there, a path begins in which the construction becomes more and more narrative, in a way fictional, you can say, until finally the great monster of the columbarium sets an endpoint. Next. Perhaps the Bond Center could also be situated here. Sure, it was never planned otherwise than with its mirror glass paneling, but the structural concrete of Rudolph's previous buildings can still be felt. The story of brutalism ends all around the globe for many reasons, just to name 3. In most parts of the world, it simply becomes too expensive to build so elaborately in concrete. Second, new energy consumption regulations are forcing other materials on facades. And here, the Bond Center is perfect. And finally, the provocation of brutality and brutalism has simply worn off. Next. The next revolution in architecture after brutalism was a technological one, just as Rainer Bernham has always intended. With the HSBC, Hong Kong has one of the world's most outstanding works of this kind to offer. Thank you very much.
So yes, I was gonna say that thank you, Oliver, for a presentation that, of course, we wish we had more time because you had included many more other projects in your research in Hong Kong, which we couldn't include in this time. But yeah, hopefully we can talk about it more later. And right now, I'm just gonna invite Patrick to share his response. Thank you. Oh, one more thing, sorry, just one more thing. I think before Patrick shares his okay, never mind. Okay, yeah, just wanted to say that before Patrick shares, please start typing your questions in the Q&A box under the live event Q&A box, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver, for this wonderful and provocative presentation on brutalism as an ideology and the brutalist as a project. It's clear that this research reflects your heartfelt connection and passion as evidence in this work. Now, in the first half of your presentation, we learned that the motivation behind your advocacy for the brutalist buildings through your conservation work on SOS brutalism. You also share with us the orthodox lens for reading and understanding the brutalist buildings as defined by Bernham through his 3 principles. You also painted a kind of fuzzy and antagonized relationship between the hardcore definition of Bernham and the Yankee practitioners, the American architects who hijacked brutalism from an ethical project and turned it into a corners projecting, piazza forming, and bush hammering stylistic approach. And all the while referencing old glories of European cities and architecture. In the second part, which represents the fruit of your research on brutalism in Hong Kong, you're suggesting let's say, the potential of a new way forward, or at least a new interpretation of the brutalist project. You use the word tendencies to describe the characteristics and practice of this movement. And by broadening and expanding the otherwise deterministic definition, we seem to have entered a more pliant and nimble phase. Of course, this also raises the question of what would be the risk of giving a kind of open-ended qualification to brutalism, of diluting its orthodoxy. Now we learn from history that new forms of architectural movement often begin with a reaction or dissatisfaction with the so-called present condition, right? The zeitgeist. And as with many of the isms that have shaped the discourse of architecture, there was always a kind of idealization at the beginning, which anchors its agenda. And this idealization, whether it has to do with the embrace of technology or a reference to history, is often premised on the belief that is beyond the depth of its surface. So in the case of Ellison and Peter Smithson, it's about the, as you worded, the essence of design, concerned with seeing the material for what they were, the sandiness of sand, the woodness of wood, and I suppose concreteness of concrete. But as always, this idealization tends to morph over time and become a kind of stylistic approach, a label, or perhaps rhetoric or monster, as you have termed it. So hence the idealism or the purity is contaminated and affected by other factors in situ and in time. So in the case of brutalism transforming from the ethical project to a kind of aesthetic one, bastardized, I guess, by the context through which it is situated. So this brings me to the second part of my, I guess, reflection and comments. I've kind of highlighted a few points of your presentation that I find interesting, and a few maybe counterpoints for discussion. So you claim that since the 1955, there lie multiple phases of evolution and transformation in brutalism. Therefore, we are now able to call this brutalist project through the premise of both and rather than either or. So from your example of the Museum of History of Frankfurt, you are making a kind of contextual reading of the brutalist work, that referencing history was not only accepted as an idea, but it was implemented. This point I find to be quite interesting. You also claim that that brutalism's influence was not only from west to east, but in the case of the museum, it was possible that the project was influenced by Japanese architect Tange's Kagawa office design. The tectonic expression of the interlocking concrete framing, echoing those of the traditional stacked timber assembly. So this willingness to read those post-66 works with a broader brutalist tendency provides a legitimate path of entry for those buildings analyzed in Hong Kong, including those designed by Jackson Wang, Sito Wai, Robert Fan, Tao Ho, and Dennis Lau. And then furthermore, by establishing the monster category, which was rejected by Benham, many of the buildings in Hong Kong subsequent or concurrent to this Boston City Hall can be situated along that brutalist genealogy. So for these monsters, they seem to flirt with Pomo as much as they are with brutalism. So rather than aiming to define only those pure brutalist identities, there's a whole range of works that one should pay attention to. And I think those are the kind of, I guess, contribution that your paper brings, in my opinion. There are interesting findings. These are the sort of interesting findings. I share a common perspective with you. There are also a few points that I'd like to bring to discussion. So I question the comments with respect to the work of Kimmel, McKinnell, and Wood, the architect of Boston City Hall, that why is it that Boston City Hall is noted as a kind of historic reference to Italian squares, whereas for Kenzo Tange it is a kind of metabolism, right? And the two connotations are not the same. One denotes a kind of historical lens, a kind of referential tendency, while the other suggests a kind of ever-evolving approach. So in the metabolist case, it's an avant-garde. It's a forward-looking kind of spirit. So if the Boston City Hall epitomizes the monster, and many of the Hong Kong brutalist projects are identified with the monster, your response will, in a way, kind of address this kind of example, these examples in Hong Kong. So that's kind of, I don't know, one comment or question that I have. The other is I find interesting is you're alluding to a very interesting terrain with respect to Sito Wai's work on the CU campus. Right. By reading and equating Sito Wai's configuration of form in the science building as an attempt to move away from the aesthetic lens and towards a kind of utopian notion of the access to knowledge. It seems that there's a possible reading, right, of the ethical project in Cito's work. Now, whether it is an ethical position or a political one, I don't know. But am I correct in saying that this reading then is beyond the surface treatment of the concrete? Maybe I have wrote down a few more points. I don't know if I have time. Yeah, and you seem to be very very much fascinated with the unpainted fair-faced concrete surface as a means to engage the Brutalist project. So I wonder if you could elaborate on why such purity or dogma is kind of vital. And moving forward, should this consideration remain relevant as climatic concerns and new concrete technologies with admixtures become a norm? Yeah. And then I guess finally, it's your discovery of the Jackson 1 residence is also fascinating. I wonder what attributed to this kind of important discrepancy between the approved drawings versus the as-built conditions. Right? So when I read that, I was wondering whether it was a tactical decision to include the note mosaic tiles, right, in the submission drawing. Was it to make sure that it would receive the kind of necessary approval, knowing too well that it would not have been applied in the construction site? Or was it, as you suggested, in kind of innocent design decision, a change of heart? Yeah. So I don't know. So I guess to conclude, maybe my point is I would say that this research contains two main agendas. The first is to raise awareness of those buildings at risk of being demolished on a global scale, including Hong Kong, and carries a kind of preservation lens for reading the Brutalist buildings. And the second agenda is to widen the definition, allowing a kind of more inclusive interpretation of Brutalism. And the sort of successful argumentation of this agenda would enable the movement to take on a projective path. So more than ever, the kind of retrospective and projective nature of the work, your work, is the much needed, let's say, critical analysis of architecture that we demand today. Okay. So that's what I can offer to you. Your interesting paper.
Yes. Thank you, Patrick. I just wanted to mention that there's like so much rich reflection there that Oliver, you can possibly respond to, but because we have three very thoughtful questions coming up, we wanted to also give time for that. But Oliver, how about just addressing Patrick's, some of the key points that he brought up in the next few minutes, perhaps?
So yeah, thanks again, Patrick, for the wonderful remarks, and thanks, Charlie, for giving me the word. Well, I like the term very much that you say the Yankees have hijacked the brutalist idea. I mean, that was in a way that was what Benham said, but when you look when you take another perspective and look around the whole world, then you see that in so many areas brutalism was hijacked. I mean, the development in the US was of especially the anger was the biggest for Benham, I would say, but there are so many examples where brutalism was in a way in opposite to something like an international style that was spread around the world, but has always a connection to where it came from. In the way of brutalism, it was more an open offer that could be transformed in different parts of the world really differently. And for many areas of the world, it was the architecture of the rebuilding after the war. For many, it was the when you think of Africa, I mean, so many nations were established in the post Second World War years of the 50s and early 60s, and so for them, brutalism was the architecture of independence. In opposite to that, when you speak with people that come from the former East Bloc, like the countries around the Soviet Union or in the Soviet Union, brutalism was seen as a kind of authoritarian state architecture. I mean, I would, and that makes it really difficult to deal there with the question of preservation, because it was linked with the regime, and so for many people fighting for these monsters in the former Soviet Union, they were facing a lot of difficulties to this agenda, and I think what is one of the most interesting observations we could do through our research is that in many cases, I mean, brutalism was in the very beginning a form of almost anonymous architecture conceived by the Smithsons. It was very close to Mies van der Rohe. It was very close to kind of industrial building. And then even in authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union, it could develop a kind of artistical freedom. And that is so fascinating, that the overall political agenda was strict, but this kind of joy of the pure sculpture, and that's really amazing what happens in the former East Bloc. It makes you doubt that it's kind of only a kind of built ideology, and I think there is more. There is much more freedom. But coming back to the points you raised, Patrick. Yeah, I think in a way I wouldn't make such strict division between what Kenzo Tange did and what the Boston City Hall does. I mean, of course, the one is more abstract, the other is much more direct. In one way, it's a direct reference to palazzo buildings, a direct reference to temples, and so and it's almost a kind of, I mean, the Boston City Hall. If you look at this cornice, it appears as if the Beaux-Arts tradition in North America never has stopped. I mean, they really kind of go back before modernism came to the States in a way, and transform all these kind of Beaux-Arts aspects into concrete, which is in a way fascinating and also strange. And in the case of Kenzo Tange, of course, it's a much more transformed and abstract way. It's not this kind of real reference. You don't see the classical Japanese architecture there, but if you know it, if you once notice it, then you will see it always. You look at it. So I would say it's coming from the same need to rearrange modernism after the Second World War, both the Kenzo Tange and both the Boston City Hall. And well, yes, I mean, it's highly interesting, this notion coming to Jackson Wang, if these tile idea was just tactical, otherwise he may have not gotten the approval. I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's technical, maybe it's just also the question, if the concrete really turns out to be that good, you can leave it bare. Otherwise, you have a second option. You have a plan B if you build it. And it would be interesting to go deeper in that detailed question. But it's always, I mean, that's the reason why once one collects plans and has a museum, because you go back to the plans and see all these details. Right. Well, yeah. So far, I'm really curious to receive more questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you both. I wish I can imagine Patrick would want to respond, but we do only have about 10 minutes. We're trying to give, trying to be really on time. So right now I'm just screening through the questions that are coming in. Thank you guys for bringing it up. I'm trying to like really kind of condense them to see what are the kind of like common denominator. And so far the common denominator so far is really to do with the intention, okay, the intention in which these buildings are built in a particular way, whether as a set of principles that they're abiding or aesthetic or style. So some of the questions that are related to that, or even as an entity, right? So some of the questions related to that, Oliver, that the questions here want you to address will be the question of whether how come these brutalist structures are mostly built in like suburban campus environment as opposed to urban entities like within the city? That's just one, please note that. And then the other one to do with intention is also to do with the question of, this is from Charles, coming in would be the idea of like, are these architects doing this as a result of kind of like just copying what's happening in UK and US, or do they have further socio-political ideology or agendas behind them? And so, yeah, so that's just the second question about whether it's really about following and copying, or is there really something that this aesthetic actually reflects the kind of motivation that is behind that production at that point in time. That's the second part. And then there are a couple more, that's similar. The question of, could this be used because of the Chinese migrant architects coming to Hong Kong and bringing their knowledge of plastering material and technique? There's just one, or is it more of a result of transnational exchange of knowledge during the 1960s and the 80s, based on publications that have been, perhaps referenced by these architects? And so these are the three questions that are all to do with intentions and motivations, which, of course, I think it's not going to be an easy one to answer because it would probably require, reading more on the discourse of brutalism itself within Hong Kong and what the architects were reading or looking at. But it would be great for you to address those things.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for everyone to raise these questions. To the notion if the buildings are more suburban or more kind of in the core of the city. Yes, I mean in many parts of the world, I would say, or in most of the cases, that brutalist architecture is not so much connected with commercial architecture, but with the state. I mean. In Hong Kong, there was an amazing amount of schools that have been built. I mean, C2Y has built a number of schools. These were all finished around 1970, and most of them all of them were exposed concrete, and most of them resemble a kind of answer to what was Kenzo Tange experiencing in Japan before. So this kind of the interlocking of elements, this kind of gigantic wooden structures turned into concrete. That is the thing. I did not show any images here, but this is something what you can experience a lot in Hong Kong, and those schools were spread around the whole town. I did not concentrate on the schools here because most of them were painted afterwards. So Hong Kong had a fantastic school architecture, I would say, around 1970. That brings me to the question: is it still brutalist when it's painted blue and pink and yellow? I would say, well, yes, it has a kind of brutalist history then, but in terms of in terms of preservation, it's no longer accessible. What was the original idea? I would say to the second question about this kind of if it's just an international tendency that was taken over. No, I have the feeling that in a way, and this is no matter where you look. I think most of the architects, or almost every architect who ever participated in that idea of that kind of post-Benham brutalism, in this kind of idea of taking exposed concrete, relating somehow in a vague sense to brutalism. I think everybody transformed it in an individual way. And so Wai Cito does, so Tao Hu does, and these are all. I mean, it's not a copy from a building that was built somewhere else. It's not a copy from a Japanese example. It's always kind of transformation. It's an international discourse about transformative forces that make this architecture special in every region of the world. So that is to the questions.
I think, yeah, there were many more questions that are related to that, like really kind of being kind of interested in the kind of socioeconomic condition that actually led to these buildings. So I'm just, you know, so I think just again, we may not, thank you so much for all the questions coming in. We may not be able to address all of them, but we thought just kind of publish them just for people to see what are the different reactions people have. But I think just to kind of go a little bit deeper into the building up on the question of intentions and motivations and the kind of conditions that actually led to these buildings. So these buildings obviously were built at different times. And so just even going to Tahoe St. Stephen's College, like, which is late 70s, early 80s, and we just, yeah, what do you think? I guess from having kind of like read it, like studied it, visited it, as opposed to just seeing it from the image in your SOS book, that you would kind of, what would you surmise in terms of, like, you know, the different kind of, like, what would motivate him to actually do this at a time that is beyond 66 or like early 70s?
Yeah, thank you, Shirley. This is excellent, because what you get when you're there at St. Stephen's is not what you may expect from the images. It's much more. It is not about prefabrication at all. It's really about craftsmanship in a way, and so the details are done so precise. And it's like maybe the last moment in time when you can afford this enormous level of craftsmanship in a building, and it was finished in around 1980. And also it's a gymnasium building, and you don't need so much insulation for that. I mean, after 1980, at least, insulation became a major topic in architecture. You have all these kind of coverings. You have all the glass facades that cover the structure. You have all this kind of reflecting elements. You have all this kind of metal panels, and so. But there, it's you really what you see is what you get. But it's not about industrial building. It's not industrialized. I mean, in the way the CUHK campus is built, I think, as far as I know, the amount of industrialized parts is not so high there. It's not about the kind of this prefabrication obsession. It's also about a way of craftsmanship. But yeah, I would say that this is what you can experience in different regions of the world. There is, I mean, for instance, when you compare it to Germany, the craftsmanship is no longer has only in some kinds of church architecture has been such an issue. In Germany, this kind of obsession with prefabrication was much higher, and there you see many differences wherever you look.
Thank you. I think, Oliver, I also just one more question. This is Samson had asked a question because he's also more familiar with the research, which is about the Hong Kong Jockey Club, or like a project like the Columbarium, Chin Wan, which is obviously built in the 80s. And so you mentioned things like the postmodernism, and of course Samson also mentioned the idea about like the Hong Kong Jockey Club Hall, which is not included in this presentation, but it was part of your research. And the question of like what was provocative about those kind of projects, apart from what you already said as a formal reading, the question of like what caught your eye to say that, okay, I could consider this as part of the category of brutalism to be analyzed, or why was it something, that why was it so bastardized? Because it is obviously not so much in like so-called the criteria of fair-faced concrete and all of that. And so we just wanted to know, basically with these examples of the Chin Wan Columbarium as well as in the Hong Kong Jockey Club Hall, which we don't have it in its presentation, how do you relate again once more the idea of postmodernism and brutalism, and also the idea of like this plural conditions in Hong Kong that actually shaped brutalism or bastardized it in a different way?
Yes, I mean, in case of the Columbarium, which it is one of the most fascinating buildings I came across during the research, because I would say that it's still an option to transform history in that way the Columbarium does. And so I think it is. I mean, it is in the term of the history of Hong Kong, it was an endpoint. But does it need to be like that? I mean, could it also evolve from that moment on? So how would it be a new brutalism? So I mean, it's always one of those questions. Is always, I mean, why are we doing this research? Is it only about preservation, or do I think that this all has a kind of future for architecture? And I would say that dealing with historic elements is still an option, and it could be an option also for the future. But I mean, it's in most of the cases it's no longer a wise decision to build in concrete. I mean, we should think about wooden constructions, and we should think about more sustainable construction. But all this concrete is there, and so we need to find out how we could transform those structures and build on from that. And even in new buildings, I would say that the work of architects from France like Lacaton Vassal are extremely inspirational, because they have this, I would say, approach that is close to the very beginning of the brutalist idea. It's not about form, it's not about aesthetic, it's not about design, it's just about doing what is necessary. And so I mean, there is a fascination of the monster buildings around, but at the same moment, I would say, why don't we go back to the Smithsons? Why don't we build this kind of almost anonymous structures that simply match the need of the people who live there, and they are not expensive. They are built in a straight and direct way. And why couldn't we go back to a new brutalism in architecture? The funny thing is that there are so many, I would say, very new brutalist structures around all over the world. I mean, there's a kind of renaissance of brutalism, not only in academic circles and not only in magazines, but really a lot of buildings. But most of them are rich people's brutalism. They're built for some villas and some expensive houses. And I think there should be a new basis of also a kind of straightforward public architecture, I would say.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Oliver. I just wanted to kind of let Patrick be part of this kind of like, as just after your response, because what the question that I wanted to ask in relation to what you both said was really about the projective cast. I think this is the word that you used, Patrick, about how this would actually inform contemporary practice today. And then, and of course, Oliver had brought up examples of how this thing, the new brutalist project, is still ongoing. And so just wanted to have your thoughts, I guess, based on that idea of like how it informs today. And could this dogma would still be applicable today, or even kind of relevant, especially at a time when we do want to go for low resource building? So yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Well, I suppose if we do go back to the Allison and Peter Smithson sort of dogma about going into the sort of the essence of the thing, I suppose this kind of reorientation to the timber as a sustainable sort of source for building could be a kind of category for considering the brutalist project. But I mean, I just find that your research in kind of has that kind of potential in moving forward. Yeah. So.
Okay, so it's great. I'm just gonna, I think my colleagues here are like considering that we can give more time. So I'm just gonna bring up a couple more questions. I think this is one question is about the idea of the tropical or the subtropical climates and how this is actually how the brutalist kind of like architecture is applied in these sort of climates. And I just want, this comment is more about what do you think about these being applied in such a climate? Because of course there's a different effect on the facade if it was built in like something that is much more kind of Europe, UK, and the States. Yeah, so have you, in your observation of SOS brutalism, I guess, how do you think these buildings perform differently, I guess, in different climates?
Well, yes, I mean, but not in a way as you would expect it. And so I experienced that, I mean, buildings in a warm climate, like in a desert climate like Israel, they are well kept, and also in Africa they are also well kept. In the Nordic countries, in Canada, we have well kept concrete. I think in a tropical climate, people are always kind of afraid that the concrete would turn dark and would turn kind of some fungus would take over. No, but I think that that's in a worldwide scope. It is almost everywhere. Even in the long term in Hong Kong, it's possible to build in that way with an exposed concrete. I mean, I've shown you one building from the CUHK campus, this student hall, this Charles residence, and there's some plans on the staircases, and there is still the exposed concrete. And so it's even under these climate conditions here or in Hong Kong, it's still possible to build it in that way. Of course, when you go to Africa and some other more tropical regions, you don't need the windows. I mean, there's for instance, there's an example of a shopping mall in Africa that goes without any windows. It's just the natural ventilation is used to bring fresh air into that building. And so there's a transformative aspect, but I would not say, and the idea of course you have these references to Le Corbusier. You have always this kind of brise soleil structure that make the shadow on the facade, and so this depends on, you don't need this in Germany so much, but even there it's just taken over because it has been also kind of trademark, and architects were using it whatever it makes sense or not. So I wouldn't say that it's such a close relation to the climate conditions, so surprisingly.
Okay, thank you. I just have one more micro question here from one anonymous person, which is about the idea of the use of the word monster. The category of monster buildings seem to be frightening in their sheer size, and yet CUHK as an example in which it is actually not so much one singular form, but more about group form. How do you think the big form is related to the group form?
Yes, I mean the monster category is of course a bit daring and also a provocation, of course. Well, I have children, and we thought of Monster University and Monster Incorporated. I mean, we really had the idea of turning a kind of frightening word into something that is no longer frightening, but that says, please care about me and please preserve me for the future. And so, of course, it is a provocation, but we also try to take this kind of rejection and turn it into something positive. And so we thought, okay, also the term brutalism is great, because in brutalism, many people say this needs, for a better appreciation, this needs a new word, because brutalism always sounds like brutality, and so we need another name. And I would always say, okay, no, it's a good name because it tells you something, and you take the people serious that have objections, that are against those buildings, and we tried to take these fears and transform it maybe through knowledge into something positive. Yeah.
Thank you, Oliver. I mean, of course, that is a very, so sorry that we have kind of gone beyond 15 minutes from the scheduled end time, but really wanted to address as much of your questions as possible. And so I think that was a nice kind of conclusion, because he kind of went back to why SOS Brutalism and the Monster Project came about and why this would be relevant to Hong Kong. And so we just want to thank you again, everyone, for being here, taking part, and for Patrick for just your thoughtful kind of like response, and for Oliver just the last 1 year just really looking at this project and situating the topic in Hong Kong. And so we look forward to your final paper, and I just wanted to remind everybody that next Tuesday at the same time, 8:30 p.m. 29th of September, we'll have our second M+ Design Trust Fellowship talk by Yasmin Triani on the idea of rethinking tradition and contemporary architectural practice in Indonesia. So please join us again then, and thank you again, and good evening.